What Tolkien seemed to intuit here is that the Middle Ages, and specifically the literature of the Middle Ages, functioned like a root screen. You could say it framed the holy, it framed the sacred because why do we have a screen there? Why would you have a curtain there? By marking something off as holy, you show that it is holy. Without that, it's just a stage.
Well, hello, and welcome to Why Are We Talking About Rabbits? Today, we have Richard Rohlin. And what he's going to do essentially is all things English, because he's a philologist and he's a historian and he's dedicated. And he's going to walk us through the fine-tuned apparatus of Western history and how the English story is in many ways the oldest story in terms of its relationship to Orthodox Christianity. That's today on WAWTAR. Well, you're back with us. The last time we talked a little bit about immersion, culture, and missionary work. Today, I want to talk about your man, Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, the concepts that are built in there, and then this theology of subcreation, among other things. So tell us, you've got a podcast project going right now.
Yeah. Well, so I got a couple of podcasts. Well, I should preface it by saying I'm one of the hosts of the Ammon Sewell podcast, which is a dedicated podcast looking at the works of J.R.R. Tolkien from an Orthodox perspective. So if you want to hear just every thought I've ever had about Tolkien and Orthodoxy and old world stuff, you can, people can go, and those podcast episodes, they're like 2 hours long. So there's plenty of stuff out there. People are listening. Yeah, we try to go deep. But the other podcast project that I'm working on right now is something called The Great Rood Screen. And it's the story of early English Christianity. So in other words, Christianity from the conversion of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes up to the Norman conquest. So there's about you could say like a 400 or 500 year period right in there where we see a very beautiful form of Christianity come to life and flourish before it doesn't really die off with the Norman conquest. That's one of the myths that I'm going to try to debunk, but it definitely changes.
Give us context. What year would you say you started to see the formation of something we can call English Christianity? And then what do the Normans do to it that definitely changes it?
Yeah. So the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons started at the very end of the 6th century, and it's completed more or less by the middle of the 7th century. And so part of what's going on is that there are actually sort of 2 waves of conversion. The first one is from the Celts, in the north, and like the Irish, and that wave is not totally successful. And then there's a second missionary wave that's sent by Pope St. Gregory the Great from Rome and Augustine of Canterbury. And this is a much more successful, sort of between the two of them. So it's like, and what that eventually, of course, you have sort of Christianity from Rome and Christianity from Ireland, and they kind of come into a little bit of conflict. And the Anglo-Saxon kings who are sitting at the Synod of Whitby and some other places, people make a bigger deal of this than it is, again, because the similarities between the two things were, say 98%, and they were arguing about a 2% difference, right? So it's this is one of those things that gets inflated nowadays, partly because the things that they were arguing about, things like the manner of tonsure, the dating of Easter, and things like this, were much more important at the time because of, you could say, the way that people to use your language, like in an old world kind of a setting, value certain things is different than the priority we place on things in a new world setting. So most people know that I shouldn't say most people, but many people know that at the time of the Great Schism and the the decades and centuries leading up to it. Obviously, the filioque is the thing that people key into now. Is this is a big problem? This was the big issue,
and it is a big issue to the creed. Yeah,
right. It is a big issue, but we key into that now because it's an idea, and to us, ideas are what are important. But if you'd asked somebody at the time, they would have said the filioque is as important, or maybe even secondary in importance to the fact that the Latins had begun using unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and whereas the East were continuing their tradition of using leavened bread in the Eucharist, and that this difference between leaven or unleavened on both sides, seemed to many people who were holy and God-fearing people to be a bigger deal, maybe, or at least as big a deal as the filioque. So because we don't, because our existence is less embodied, right? We tend to, when we see something like that, we're like, oh, well, that's ridiculous. What a silly thing to be.
What a silly thing to be hung up over. Whereas the filioque, oh yeah, that's an important thing because that's an idea, right? And so there's this misconception, you could say, that the things that you think in your head, those are the real things. And then the way that you physically embody it, that's more or less incidental. And
which
that's
is ironic, right?
Yeah.
Because we're a more materialistic society that tends to dismiss the importance of the material, which is odd, right?
Yeah. But I mean, it's sort of related. There's a you could say like a kind of Gnosticism that folds back on itself and becomes materialism once the proper relationship between these things has been decoupled.
Now go back to that history, because this is what I love, the history. So the English missionary, shall we say, push from the South or from Europe, would that be now known as what is that the thrust that becomes Western Christianity that we Orthodox would say is something like not quite right, and the Celts had it closer to the Orthodox tradition, or is that simplification?
So I think basically that's an oversimplification. Okay. And one of the things that I want to do with this podcast is kind of address that idea a little bit.
I see. Okay.
So basically there are two bad takes that I'm trying to work on. Not so much debunking, but maybe just addressing a little bit and adding some nuance. The first would be this idea that the English church from an Orthodox perspective, I mean, obviously the podcast is going to be on Ancient Faith Radio, right? So it's an Orthodox podcast. We're looking at English Christianity from a solidly Eastern Orthodox lens, right? But so the first bad take would be basically something like Orthodox England was totally Orthodox. In fact, some people like Vladimir Loss will say that they actually stayed with the Eastern churches at the time of the Great Schism in 1054. And it wasn't until 1066 that, when William the Conqueror brought Latin Christianity to England, that's when the schism actually happened in England. And, something like this, which I don't think is really correct at all. For a number of it's not just wrong. It's one of those things that's like wrong in multiple ways. And so it'll take some time and some nuance to kind of address that.
It's that's certainly part of the project is to filter it out.
It's certainly the case that at the year 1054, people in England probably wouldn't have thought of themselves as being in schism with, for instance, the Patriarch of Constantinople. And they certainly sent lots of people, young princes, either if you were a young Anglo-Saxon prince, you went either to Constantinople or to Rome, on pilgrimage or to work as a mercenary and all these different things. And it's certainly the case they wouldn't have thought of themselves as being in schism, because at the time, nobody knew that the Great Schism was the Great Schism.
Right. I was going to say.
Yeah. So that's very clear.
Do this classic. Why does it? I can hear a I know why it matters to me.
Yeah.
Why does it matter, though? In some ways, what's the legacy of this English history vis-a-vis your faith, Orthodoxy, my faith, in America today?
So this is kind of related to the other take that I'm also trying to address, which would be the idea. It's basically like Anglican branch theory, which, Anglicans in the audience, not hating on you. Obviously, I don't agree with Anglican branch theory, but which is basically this idea that the English church represents like the third branch of historic Christianity, and that the three branches of historic Christianity are therefore Rome and England and Constantinople, something like that, which is, of course, I mean, it's also really funny because they make the classic, you could say like the classically British mistake of lumping all Eastern peoples together into just kind of like one category, right. But and so what I want to show is kind of first of all the continuity of English Christianity with the Orthodox faith.
I see.
And specifically, I want to show how it's different from, for instance, what Anglicanism is now, or what Roman Catholicism is now, or even what Eastern Orthodoxy is, but also how the things that are important and the things that are essential in the Orthodox faith are all present there in Anglo-Saxon Christianity in a really beautiful way that should be something which we as speakers of the English language, I assume your people were Dutch.
With a
Dutch,
name like
German, with a name like Heers, and my people were mostly German, but we're all speakers of the English language, and anyone who speaks the English language, which is a lot of the world, maybe the majority of the world, anyone who speaks the English language is in some sense the descendant of the Anglo-Saxons, and their culture is to some extent also our culture. Yeah. And so when you so as a medievalist, this is how I became Orthodox, because I was a medievalist and I studied Anglo-Saxon Christianity, and I found, oh man, this harrowing of hell thing, this is amazing. Oh, this kind of personification of the cross, right? This dream of the Rood, which is this prayer where the cross kind of comes to life and intercedes for us, and all these different things. Like, this is all really beautiful, and I've never heard of this before in my life as a Protestant. And then when I came to an Orthodox church, and you look up on the ceiling, it's like, oh, there's the harrowing of hell right there. We hear pray the prayer to the cross. Oh, most venerable and life-giving cross of the Lord, help us, right? So like, all these things just kind of like came back around full circle.
So you didn't have, and this is to anybody out there, Orthodox or non-Orthodox, when someone converts to anything, there is an inclination, and this happened in me, to reject. And the rejection becomes the source of energy. And for me,
there's that dialectic process. Right. Yeah.
You didn't. So I fled things English. Sure. Also, the language, I enjoyed sitting in Slavonic liturgies, and I've come around to be a less sort of radical or zealous.
Yeah.
Did you have that moment? Were you always trying to inculcate and recapitulate this English story into your Orthodoxy? Because you're a convert, right?
Yeah. I'm not, just as a person, like my wife has a saying. She always says, I'm not an either or kind of girl. And she'll say that, because we're talking about like dinner choices, or we're talking about, like, well, should we do this fun thing or this fun thing? Right. So this is the thing. I'm not an either or kind of guy. I am not, I've never been about that kind of dialectic process, which is like, I can only understand this new thing that I'm accepting within the framework of the stuff that I'm rejecting, right? And it does seem to me that most converts go through that process. That wasn't my process. I mean, I did actually have to formally, out loud, in front of a bunch of people, including family and friends, formally, abjure and reject my previous errors as part of my reception into the Orthodox Church. So I'm not saying,
was it a sit down? Like,
No. This is before my reception.
You had to.
Yeah, there was
an announcement of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, it's in one of the OCA service books, in the Great Book of Needs. I think there's a service in there for receiving somebody from a Reformed background, and so I'm sort of from a Reformed Baptist background, and so there were, I had to renounce iconoclasm, I had to renounce Calvinism, I had to renounce the sort of. I
see, in a liturgical setting. Okay.
Yeah. No, like
in a living room with like your relatives or something.
Yeah, no, but I did have family and friends who came to my reception.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So I say all that to say, I'm not saying I didn't reject my former errors, or I think everything can carry over, poured over, something like that. Nothing, no sloppy ecumenism or anything like that. But for me, the reason that I loved Orthodoxy and knew it to be true is because I'd already encountered all of those beautiful things, you could say, in like bits and pieces. And then I came to Orthodoxy and it was just all there together in a single place. And that was one of the ways that it was very intuitive to me to say, well, I already love this harrowing of hell thing, which, I mean, there's an Anglo-Saxon poem called The Harrowing of Hell that was read liturgically on Holy Saturday. And if you look at it, it's based largely on the text of the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is also the text, the Eastern text on which most of our liturgical services and prayers and hymns and things like this around the whole descent into Hades are based. So this is it's a clearly Orthodox thing. The poem is totally Orthodox, you could say, in its theology and outlook. It was written, 300 or 400 years before the Great Schism. There's nothing unorthodox about that poem. And so this is the thing that I want to show people, is that there's continuity, there's something beautiful, and there are ruptures in that continuity. Obviously, the Great Schism, scholasticism, that's one rupture. Another rupture that's maybe even sort of more important from a strictly an English Christianity perspective is, of course, the Reformation, because the English Reformation was extremely iconoclastic, even more so. I mean, Luther never burned a church down or burned relics. He valued these things. You can say what you want to say about Luther being wrong about other stuff, but you wouldn't have, there's this, when Cromwell was was basically the king of England. He wasn't the king, but the protector, whatever. Yeah. When he was running England, he had every single stained glass window in England broken. He had, the relics of the saints dug up and burned and scattered. He had every single organ in England burned, because, I mean, this is the thing we have to remember, is that for Puritans, it wasn't just icons or the images of the saints and of Christ and of his mother or their relics. It wasn't just those things that were considered to be idolatrous. They considered music to be idolatrous, like beautiful music. And so, I mean, this is from a musical history perspective, there's very little surviving sheet music in English from before Cromwell's time, because it was all burnt.
What does it mean to these cats? These are the cats that got on the ships to come settle America.
That's the thing. Yeah. So this is the thing. Those were the guys that got on the ships and came over and settled America. And American culture has always been very hesitant about the idea of beauty or hierarchy in a religious setting.
Right.
We actually tend to be okay with it in a civil setting, right? So this is why we can have a mural or fresco on the ceiling of the United States Capitol, which shows the apotheosis of George Washington. George Washington ascending into the heavens, being greeted by the classical goddesses and deified like a Caesar, right? So that's okay. We have a large temple to Abraham Lincoln in our nation's capital. That's okay. But can you imagine the general sort of response from thousands and millions of young, bright-eyed evangelical kids like me who went on a field trip to the Lincoln Memorial when they were kids, right? Can you imagine how those same kids would feel if we removed the Lincoln Memorial and we put a giant shrine to the Virgin Mary in its place, right? Can you imagine? Yeah, minds would blow, right? And so, anyway, I'm not saying this to pick on anybody. I hope that's clear,
no, we're not worried about that. But this podcast feels like it's like an invitation to which I think all this subculture of sort of Orthodox or Neoplatonic conversation is trying to do something like baptize all those English strands and say it's okay to talk in these ancient ways. Yeah, it feels like your podcast is doing that.
What I'm trying to do is something more like, let's go back before Elizabeth, right? It's really under Elizabeth. People always give like the whole Henry VIII, thing a hard time, but Henry VIII considered himself a Roman Catholic until the moment that he died. But it's really under Elizabeth that the English Reformation is born.
No
and
doubt.
It's really under Elizabeth that the Elizabethan Compromise the whole idea of the Church of England as a via media, not between Catholicism and Protestantism, by the way, but between Calvinism and Lutheranism. But that's a different podcast. That's when the Elizabethan Compromise is born, and all of this stuff, right? And then it's the Puritans who are saying, no, that's not far enough. Those guys leaving, right, and coming here. That's basically how we get the United States. And so what I want to try to do is to say, let's go back further. Okay. Let's go back to a time before Elizabeth and ask the question, what was English Christianity actually like? And I'm focusing specifically on the places where English Christianity was originally much more closely aligned with the rest of the apostolic tradition.
Is this the Western Rite inclination? Not really.
No, to me, this is not. I mean, we're talking about
people
this.
Who don't know Western Rite. Yeah. If you're an Orthodox Christian, there's liturgical traditions. Western Rite is a type of attempt to, again, like return to English Christianity that was in alignment with the Eastern liturgical tradition, something like that. But that's different than what you're trying to remind us about.
Yeah. I mean, so we were talking about this a little bit before the podcast. Obviously, I've got no beef with Western Rite Orthodox people, and I've got a lot of very good friends and godparents in an Orthodox Western Rite parish. So this is no beef with that, but that's not really what this podcast is about, because what I'm trying to show is that the Christianity of the English, and we are going to talk a little bit about Celtic Christianity as sort of setting up the background, but the podcast is really about English Christianity, is that the Christianity of the English, and this includes the literature produced by them, things like the Beowulf poem.
Okay.
Was fully Orthodox. It was different in certain ways. Obviously, the liturgical rite would have been one of those ways, although there are probably more similarities there than people realize. But what I'm trying to do is not say, hey, let's all LARP as Anglo-Saxons, but rather to say, for me, conservatism is always love of parents, right? And so what I'm trying to say is, as an English-speaking person, these are your parents, these are your ancestors, and this is how they worship God, and this is what they were doing on Holy Saturday, and it's really the same thing that you're doing on Holy Saturday now. It's really the same thing you're doing on Pascha now, and so it's to help people sort of see that continuity of history, as opposed to feeling like there has to be a rupture.
Well, I'll just say one thing, and I want to ask you about this theology of subcreation. I really identify with what you just said on this podcast, because I wouldn't say I get in trouble, but people don't like that we lump the old world. I mean, you're talking about now you're parsing really particular Christian moments, right, in Western Europe, but I'm lumping in this really ridiculous way where a Muslim and a Christian, Orthodox Christian, and I don't know, a Zoroastrian have more in common than, say, an enlightened evangelical conservative Christian in America. But I do think when you do the analysis correctly, it does teach, in a way that allows for us to get out of our own sort of episte, our own way of knowing for a moment, so we can see ourselves a little clearer. And so I know this risk that you run, right, of kind of confusing. For instance, in the East, the Ethiopians always you did some great stuff with Pajot on Ethiopia. I loved it. And then, you can hear the naysayers. Well, it's not the same. And of course, we know it's not the same, but it's an instructional piece to really help us understand ourselves.
Right.
And it doesn't mean we're liturgically bound now to be brothers with an Ethiopian. But it's complicated, but it's important that it's complicated. We shouldn't make it less complicated than it is, right? On someone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, as far as what you should do liturgically, you should do whatever your bishop says and whatever your parish does. Like that's it for me. It's like, and the way that we pray at home, we don't mix and match these prayers and these prayers, right? Like we have the prayer book and we have, prayer rule that our spiritual father gave us, and we try to keep to that. And if we don't, then we'll confess it. But so I'm not telling people, hey, mix and match, or something like this, but But I mean, somebody like St. Cuthbert, for instance, good example, right? St. Cuthbert is like, he's like the Anglo-Saxon Saint Seraphim. So Saint Seraphim of Sarov is my patron saint. And I really love him. And if you read the life of St. Cuthbert and you look at the way that he prayed and the ascetic life that he led, and if, in fact, if you look at the ascetic lives of all of the Anglo-Saxon saints, there's not a single one of them that would have been out of place in Constantinople or out of place on the Holy Mountain. Not Richard, a single one.
We just went and took our field worker. His name is Alistair, but he's baptized Oswald, and he just joined. And we went to the UK. Guess where we went? We went to St. Oswald's Well.
Yes.
With Father Seraphim Aldea.
And that's so great.
That's his guy, Ozzy, who is now in the Georgian Republic. He working for us. He is his spiritual son and was baptized. We went there for his baptism. And let me tell you, the well water was running. And there he was baptized in that water. And then I felt that oldness appropriate to the same thing I felt in Georgia, the same thing I felt in Ethiopia. It's an oldness that is true. It applies. Yeah, it was real cool.
Yeah. That whole idea of like the Christian household, the ecumen, right? This is a Christian household. In my Father's house, there are many mansions, it's really something like in my Father's tent, there are many partitions,
Right.
And I'm not, again, this is not intended to be sloppy ecumenism. I'm not saying that all of these, things are the same now or something like that, but we can go back to a time where you did have these different expressions of apostolic Christianity that were more similar than they were different.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Those are the things that I really feed off of and enjoy. So I can sit down and I can read the Beowulf poem, which was certainly written by an Orthodox monk sometime in the 700s. Right.
Interesting.
I can sit down and read something like even like later stuff, Middle English stuff. There's a Middle English rendering of several of a lot of the Dionysian corpus. Right. And so I can read that. And, this is just the theology of St. Dionysius the Areopagite. Right. But in Middle English and things like that. So I can read that stuff and enjoy that. And for people who are, if that's your deal, then I want other people to kind of experience that same joy and that feeling of closeness, that feeling of St. Cuthbert could walk into my church and he wouldn't understand the language because English has changed a bunch. And he would be a little bit unfamiliar with the liturgy, although probably a lot more familiar with like Matins or Vespers or something. But maybe a little unfamiliar with the format of the liturgy, but he would know exactly where he was, and he would know exactly that he would absolutely know that he was in church,
and he would understand the mystical machinations of what's happening around him.
Right. And, as a holy man, certainly. Right. But I also believe that's true of St. Paul. If St. Paul were to rise from the dead and come and walk into our church one Sunday morning, I mean, stranger things have happened. Then I feel very comfortable, very confident that he would know where he was, even though obviously a lot has changed in 2000 years.
Well, that goes to the Enlightenment. We can talk about that. But so what's this theology of subcreation?
Yeah. So
I want to get at.
So the thing where I've been a little rambly, but the thing that kind of started me down this road is this little quote from Tolkien, which it's very short. And this is the setting here is a conversation between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien when they're both very young. Obviously, they're very famous friends. Like a lot of friends, they had ins and outs, ups and downs. And like most people, humans, they eventually came to certain, you could say, like boundaries in their relationships. Like a river that I can't cross. I can look to you from the other side, but I can't go there with you, right? So, but they're both Christians. Lewis is Church of England, and at the time, he's very solidly you could say like the low church category. Although he does kind of get higher church as he gets older. And so for Lewis, the Middle Ages held a great deal of beauty and attraction, just like classical Greece did. But there were certain medieval ideas and practices which he could intellectually engage with the fact that had been a thing, but he couldn't enter into it himself. And the veneration of the saints is one of the biggest of these objections. In fact, Lewis seems to have had almost like a nervous breakdown several years later when a spiritual father of his, who was a celibate Anglican clergyman, member of the Order of St. John the Divine, which is like this group of celibate Anglican clergy at the time, tried to get him to pray the rosary, and Lewis just couldn't do it. He sort of had a breakdown. Tolkien, on the other hand, for him, the faith of the Middle Ages was this vibrant, living thing. And so Tolkien recalls, this is from his biography, he says, "We were coming down the steps from Magdalen Hall," this is at Oxford, "long ago in the days of our unclouded association, before there was anything, as it seemed, that must be withheld or passed over in silence. I said that I had a special devotion to St. John." Probably St. John the Evangelist, I think, is the one he means. Of course, John is his first name. Lewis stiffened, his head went back, and he said something in the brusque, harsh tones, which I was to later hear him use again when dismissing something he disapproved of. "Well, I can't imagine any two persons more dissimilar." We stumped along the cloisters, and I followed, feeling like a shabby little Catholic, caught by the eye of an evangelical clergyman of good family, taking holy water at the door of a church. A door had slammed, and never more should I now be able to say in his presence. And he quotes from a Middle English poem called The Pearl. "But Christi's mercy and Mary and John, these am the ground of all my bliss." In other words, but Christ's mercy and Mary and John, these are the ground of all my joy. And suppose that I was sharing anything of my vision of a great rood screen through which one could see the Holy of Holies. So a rood screen is like a large carved wooden screen. I'm so sorry. I have loud dogs in the background. You guys hear his
dogs?
Yeah.
He's not being attacked.
I cannot do anything about that. My dogs are keeping me from being attacked right now. So a rood screen is a large carved wooden screen. In medieval churches, it's usually located between the sanctuary and the nave, in basically the same place or a very similar place to the location of the iconostas in our temples, right? And functionally, liturgically, it basically served the same purpose. Most of the iconostas in Western and Northern Europe, most, not all, were destroyed during the Reformation, both by reformers, but also many were just taken down during the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation as well.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And but it was usually above the screen. The reason it's called a rood screen, the rood is an Old English word for the cross. So above the rood screen, usually suspended, there was a large crucifix, and it was flanked on either side by Mary, the Mother of God, and by St. John the Evangelist. And so you have this, but Christ's mercy, that's the cross, and Mary and John right there. So he's quoting from an from a Middle English poem about this. And the poem he's quoting is a mystical dream vision. It's written in Middle English. It has to do with sort of being granted a vision of like almost like a theodicy. But through the lens of the liturgy. And so in the poem, the visionary, the poet says, in other words, that these events and these holy people who are depicted at the top of the rood screen, these are the ground of all of his bliss. And what, we can talk a lot more about what's the role of a rood screen and an iconostas and things like this. But what Tolkien seemed to intuit here is that the Middle Ages, and specifically the literature of the Middle Ages, functioned like a rood screen. You could say it framed the holy, it framed the sacred because why do we have a screen there? Why would you have a curtain there? By marking something off as holy, you show that it is holy. Without that, it's just a stage, right?
And so the culture of the Middle Age. So Oswald Spengler is going to write The Decline of the West. And he's going to say there's this Magian era that bleeds into the Middle Ages, the Magian era, the magic of the magician. And he talks about this period being demarcated by the type of temple that is like a cave that walls off the rest of sort of the fallen world from the beauty and bliss, right, of the liturgy, where he says all the meaning comes. And he's saying this type of this time period, this middle, really it's really orthodoxy into the Middle Ages, is actually a protection, he says, and a place where within those walls, all the great mysteries are kept, but that they're kept too tightly and they die in a sense. And is Tolkien then going to say something like, I'm protected here from the wiles of the rest of the West? Is he in this kind of space? And is it relevant to your conversation of subcreation?
Yeah. So this is where subcreation comes in. So what Tolkien would have said is probably something more along the lines of the holy is the paradise hasn't moved, right? The purpose of the rood screen is to conceal it.
Yeah.
So that by concealing it, you can reveal it, right? And this is always the way that God is. I mean, this is the whole, one of the major ideas that underlines all those different parables of the sower that Christ tells in the Gospels, right? Is this idea that for truth or for beauty or anything like this to be revealed in the world has to first be concealed. And so Tolkien believed that literature could work in this way. And of course, in the context of this quote, he means medieval literature. But the case that I've tried to make in things that I've written, essays that I've published, talks that I've given, is that he basically saw this is what his own work had the potential to do.
I see.
Which is to, I mean, you asked me, I think before we started recording, is Tolkien like the primer on old world thinking or something like that? That was the question. Right, something similar.
Right,
yeah. And in a certain way, yes, because Tolkien basically, I think, saw, and I would never say it's anything as petty, as sort of petty as, oh, well, he was just saying, it's all an allegory, like, Narnia or something like that. But he wouldn't have said that, but he did, I think, see that by taking beauty and things like this and sort of wrapping it in not just a literary construct, but a literary construct that actually takes a good amount of study to understand and really appreciate, right? The fact that something like the Silmarillion is hard for people to read is actually part of what makes the Silmarillion beautiful, right? Just like
a catechumen should take a while to enter the holy space.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be a day or two. It should be a year or two or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's exactly that kind of thing. I mean, this whole idea of the parable of the sower, right? So the parable of the sower, which is a parable about parables, it's a meta parable, right? Because his disciples ask him, what's the meaning of this parable? Why do you speak to people in parables? And what's the meaning of this parable? And he says, well, if you don't understand this parable, then how will you understand any other parable? So what he's saying is, this is a meta parable. It's a parable about parables. And the purpose of this parable is to teach you why I teach in parables.
Right.
So then if you look at the parable itself, you see that anything that springs up easily, anything that springs up quickly, it withers and dies, right? Or it gets taken and snatched away by the evil one.
Yeah.
What grows? It's the stuff that falls on good soil and it bears fruit in its season, right? Which, according to the very first Psalm, this is what a righteous man does. He bears fruit, not constantly, not immediately, but in his season, right? And so the fact that, and so for Tolkien, the experience of studying the literature and the faith of the Middle Ages was a revelation of holiness to him. And I think that his works can function in a similar way. So this kind of takes us to this idea of subcreation, which is kind of what I wanted to talk about. And then we spent a lot of time on other things, which is fine because there's always next podcast.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
But he said he's got this idea, and it's explicitly spelled out in a poem of his, and also in an essay of his, very well-known essay of his called On Fairy Stories. But then it's also like it's one of the main, you could say, theological, philosophical undercurrents of his entire work. Like everything he writes is, among other things, kind of focused on this idea. And this idea is the idea of subcreation. And so basically, his basic thought is that that we make by the law in which we're made. That's the way he says it in one of his poems. So in other words, we are made in the image of God. God is a maker. God is a creator. God is a shaper. You know, the old English word for a poet is a shop, which is related to our word for shape. You know,
Okay.
and so the
Carver.
And so God is a maker. He's a shaper, right? And so we're made in God's image, and therefore we're made to be little creators, little, you know. And so the term he uses is sub-creation, right? Creating under the primary creation.
Mm-hmm.
And so for Tolkien, this is why it's not a misuse of human power, of our powers of mind and imagination and art and things like this to tell stories, to paint pictures, to build tables and things like this. And ultimately for him, that's a defense of his art as a storyteller.
Would you say that I was talking to Aidan Hart about this, the iconographer in England. Is there, though, an alignment that artists should maybe not consciously try to be aware of? Is there a road, though, on which all the greatest art travels in some ways, therefore making imagination something more like alignment of images rather than simply the creation or the elevation of my image? Shouldn't the images in some way be shaped by something like a middle road, or is that not Tolkien idea?
No, so Tolkien is really conscious of how dangerous this is. This is one of the things people are always like,
Fantasia, right? Like the idea of like fantasy.
Yeah, right. People are always not all people, but I did have somebody once who wanted to push back on this a little bit. He said, well, Tolkien doesn't say anything about the dangers of subcreation gone wrong. I said, oh, really? And so we started going through the legendarium. And of course, the best example of an example of subcreation gone wrong is the forging of the One Ring of Power, right? So what is the One Ring is this, it's a subcreation. It's made of the stuff of primary creation, which stories are as well. Like we bring the things from the world that we know into the stories that we tell. You know, I can even do something totally fantastic. The example Tolkien always likes to use of like an outlandish invention in a story is something like a green sun. Like imagine a world where the sun is green. How is everything? What's different, right? Mm-hmm. But even then, I'm taking two things from the primary world that are only related indirectly, which is the sun and then the color green, which they're related, but they're related indirectly. And then I'm mashing them up and I'm being like, okay, well, what if there was a dude who's like half horse and half man, right? You know, and we called him a centaur, right? And then he's really smart. So then he's the information centaur.
Right. But it still all comes from primary substance.
Yeah.
It's not unhinged and unrelated.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but the One Ring is all of these things. It's a subcreation. It's from primary substance. It's a great work of art. But what's it for? It's for domination. It's for forcing your will upon other people, and it's inherently, corrupting. And it's very like ontology. It's very influence is evil. And so, so Tolkien is really conscious of how dangerous this is. But what he says is basically that, just the ancient maxim, right? Abuse does not, what is it? How's it go? Non tollit ipsum. I know it in Latin, but he was basically saying just because something is abused doesn't mean you shouldn't use it properly.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of his idea about subcreation. So again,
the exception doesn't negate the rule.
Yeah. And so something that I've been really interested in is this idea of whether or not of attempting to do a sort of orthodox appraisal of Tolkien's theology of subcreation, because it is a theological idea that he has, and it's one of his most potent ones. And you can find a lot of people who write, and they're very clearly influenced by him now, both Orthodox people, Roman Catholic people, Protestant people who are writing influence from him. But of course, Tolkien's not a holy father. And so and obviously there are a lot of things in the in the Holy Fathers about the dangers of imagination and fantasy and things like this.
Mhm.
So part of the question for me is, well, what kind of dangers, like what kind of imagination are they talking about? What kind of fantasy are they talking about? And it seems to be a combination of things. One of the main uses of fantasy that we fall into most as human beings, and that we're explicitly told we should engage in, is the idea of sort of like imagining how things could have gone. Well, in this conversation with this person, if they said this, then I would have said this, and they would have been really embarrassed. Or man, I'm doing such a good job. What if the bishop notices me and decides I should become a deacon?
Yeah.
I heard a story about this, or maybe read a story about this. Someone was like visiting Athos, and late at night, he gets up to go to the bathroom or something, is walking down, and he hears, this monk in a cell sort of praying the prayers of ordination to the diaconate over himself, which is like an extreme case of spiritual delusion.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So these are, but it extends to just things like, I wish my life was better than it is, or
Right.
man, what if I married that person instead of this person, or things like this. So using our imagination to kind of say, to basically just conjure up a world that's not true. I don't mean not true in like the non-factual sense, but not true, in its essence, like down
Mm-hmm.
to its core. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a fantasy of power. It's a fantasy of dominion over other people. It's a fantasy of, I wish I was something more than what God has made me to be, or I wish I was doing something other than what God has me doing right now.
Does this imply artistry as needing license? So by that, I mean, so a person will create the thing that they already are a part of, or I will be able to write about what I know in a way that you won't be able to write about. But if you and I both know, say, liturgy, or we both know humility, or we both know whatever, redemption in the same way, in some way our art will express that. And so to have license is to somehow have become entered into something like a holy life. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying saints are the only ones that can create.
Yeah.
But I am interested in this idea that there does seem to be a license within the Orthodox East anyway, that says something like go at it, because you're participating in a spiritual life that allows for something beautiful. Now,
so the tricky thing to all of this is how much great art has been made by incredibly degenerate people.
I know.
This is one of the most difficult things to account for, I think. I think that it is true that orthodoxy, it is true that art does need license, I think. And a license let's use the word blessing. Art needs a blessing, right? Mm-hmm. In the sense of it needs to be participating in that which is higher. Let's use the Romantics as an example.
Yeah, good.
Byron and Shelley and all these guys. Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, these people just led, not all the Romantics, but many of the Romantics led just wildly degenerate lives, just wildly degenerate. And, but they produced a lot of really good, lasting, durable art, because we're still looking at those paintings and we're still telling those stories. I think something's got to last at least 100 years before we can really decide whether or not it's going to be great art. And obviously that means that Tolkien still has actually a lot of Tolkien's earlier stuff, like the Silmarillion material, was written in the 19-teens. So a lot of his stuff is 100 years old, but I think that Tolkien will stand the test of time. I love Narnia, but I'm not sure that people will still read Narnia in 100 years. That's kind of an open question to me. I hope so. But all this to say, you've got these incredibly degenerate people who are making good, beautiful, durable works of art. And so you have to kind of ask what's going on there. The way that Chesterton threads this needle a little bit is to say something like, the art was the only sane thing about somebody like this.
Well, yeah, it's a Dostoevskian idea too, which is it's because I touched, I was in the garbage. I can tell you exactly where it begins.
Yeah.
And maybe it's in illustrating that, that essence of their suffering or something, that they help us to see something beautiful.
Well, and if I can say something that sounds maybe a little weird, I don't know how kooky or mystical this is going to sound, but here we go. I also think there's, we talk about the danger a lot of coming to something holy when we're unprepared. This is why in the Orthodox Church, we put a tremendous amount of focus. I mean, for the layperson, it's almost your entire spiritual life is preparing for communion, right? Yeah. We put a tremendous amount of focus on being ready to receive the body and blood of Christ in a worthy manner, not as worthy people, but in a worthy manner, right? There's a difference. But I think that when you come into contact with beauty, right, in as much as beauty is something participating in God, right, as something that comes from God, when you come into contact with beauty in an unprepared way, I think it can destroy your life. And I think that, I mean, especially like looking at the, Byron and Shelley and people like this, who I'm very interested in, and so I've studied them a lot. I think that they really did come into contact with something beautiful in a, you could say, in a mystical way, in a noetic way, but they were not prepared for it.
Why couldn't they? Why couldn't, if they're created in God's image?
Yeah. Well, this is the thing.
Yeah. Like, why wouldn't it happen? It could.
Yeah. And so I think they came into contact with something that was really beautiful, and they broke on it. And the works of art that have survived are these splinters.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But they're good splinters, but there's splinters of that breaking. So this is my kind of personal theory about that, I guess. But
that makes sense.
But yes, I think that art does need a blessing. It doesn't mean that you need like a censorship panel, like a church and state kind of censorship.
I'm
panel.
with you. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, not saying that at all. But I'm saying that as a Christian doing art, what should that look like? Well, it should look like you living the mystical, ascetic, liturgical life of the church first and foremost. And that's who you are. And then whatever art comes out of that is going to be maybe not the thing that makes blockbusters, because it probably won't be something that feeds the lowest common denominator, but it'll be something true.
Tell us about, before we go, you're doing a book.
Yeah. So this is kind of the thing, flowing out of all of this, is, I've been working for the last 20 years or so on, it's hard to describe what it is because it's not a novel. And this book is just like 3 or 4 small excerpts from a very large project. And what that very large project is basically an attempt that I started about 20 years ago when I was very young. It's an attempt that I started to try to figure out what does it mean for there to be a culture that you belong to? What does it mean for there to be what does it mean? Because I just felt the poverty of the, evangelical fundamentalist culture that I was in, but then I also saw the beauty of this old world culture, which is, we talked about this before. I grew up in, you could say, like adjacent to Chinese culture.
Yeah, that's right.
And it was beautiful, and it had its own aesthetic. It had its own, artistic motifs, had its own cuisine, all these different things, and they had this beautiful way of hanging together. And what I felt was that the culture that I lived in was very, compared to that, it was very colorless. It was very sort of beige, and lacking in anything that I felt like I could pass on to my children, right? And so one of the things that I tried to do was to start figuring out, and I did this through invention, because this is how I am. If I read a story I like, I will try to go and write a story like that story, because that will help me understand the story that I enjoyed. Right.
Yeah.
And so through invention, through storytelling, through poetry, like long form narrative poetry, also shorter poetry, like hymns and sonnets, and then eventually even through liturgy, trying to understand, like, what is it that makes a culture? What is it? You're talking about old world culture.
I love
this. Has been one of my main ways of exploring that. So this book that's coming out, it's going to be published by Darkly Bright Press. It has, you could say, like the first unveilings of some of this. It's by no means complete. It's by no means perfect. I could sit on it for the rest of my life and try to perfect it and never publish it. And I would be okay with that. But Darkly Bright Press is run by Christopher Tompkins, who's a great guy. He's Orthodox, definitely somebody worth talking to. And he suggested we do this book project together. So I'm very excited about it.
Me too.
And it's only going to be about 60 or so, 60, 70 pages long. So it's going to be more like a little booklet. Let's say there's a narrative conceit.
Okay.
By which all of these stories are held together, but they're within the narrative conceit. They're supposed to be by different authors. So they are different works in different styles. And then there's a critical apparatus on top of this explaining what you could say is what we could say were my translation choices. So that's the conceit, is this is a book I found or was given to me and I'm translating it. And so here it is.
And you're trying to create an impression
yes,
of culture.
Yes.
I see. It's not linear in terms of the narrative.
Yeah. So it's completely non-linear. And there's, like I said, this first volume that's coming out is very slim. And this is sort of testing the waters. And if people like it and are interested in it, I have enough for several much longer collections. Let's just say I've been working on this stuff for 20 years. So I have a lot of material.
Okay. This is,
I have a lot of material. So we'll see how it does.
Come back.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when it comes out, maybe we can have a little chat about it and we can talk about old worlds in fiction. And
people like when you come on.
I like coming on. So
I mean, we're a little crowd over here, but we're getting bigger. But mostly they like, I think there's something about your honesty that's really sharp. Yeah. All right, brother. So this was nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll do it.
Thank you.
We'll keep in touch.
Thanks so much for having me on, John.
All right, brother. We'll talk.
God bless you. Talk to you later.
Care.
Bye.
Take care. Shanice Gagi Marjos to you, Richard Rohlin. This is First Things Foundation. This is John Heers. This is our podcast. We love you for coming on. Check out the restaurant, check out our podcast, check out our pod class, become a recurring donor. That would be fantastic. When you become a recurring donor, you get discounts on things like our KP journeys, which take you to places like Georgia, West Africa, Guatemala. But what this is all trying to do is free hands and feet of our field workers, our volunteers who spend 2 years serving the forgotten among us. Check out our website, www.first-things.org. Au revoir. Nakvamdis. What's another one? Kambufo. That's Bambara. See you later. Peace out.